Hello, everyone. So we're continuing today with a situation where we've done two videos in the last couple of weeks, and we're continuing today with the situation where looking at the consequences of the ideas that were developed during the Reformation period. And we're saying in the last video that actually Martin Luther developed his idea of, well, actually, before he put up the actual 95 Theses in 1517, the couple of years before that, he had done a doctorate in theology, of course, about 1512. And in the following years, 12 to 15, 16, that 3 or 4 years, Luther had done a very in-depth study on various different books in the Bible, especially Paul's writings, the Psalms and Galatians and Corinthians and all that sort of thing. And he'd come to a very strong conclusion that all that was required was faith in order to achieve salvation. So he during his time as a monk, he couldn't do enough penance. He was sleeping sort of 4 hours a night, sometimes outside, doing fasting, doing penance, going to confession for 2 or 3 hours at a time, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. He could never do enough. And he swung from that then to the other extreme of thinking that there was no need to do anything at all other than believe. That was his theory of faith alone. He developed that over the years from 1512 to 1516, 17. And then in 17, he actually put up the 95 Theses and everything sort of developed from there. But I want to take it forward a bit from that. We're dealing with the 1520s at this stage. And actually in 1520 itself, Martin Luther wrote 3 books, but one of them he wrote was called An Appeal to the Christian Nobles in Germany. And what he basically was appealing for in that booklet, or that book, was that he had given up hope on the senior clergy, the bishops and the Pope and the cardinals reforming the church. So he decided to appeal to the German nobles in order to bring about this reform. However, he didn't actually fully understand, one has to say, where this would all end, because as the 1520s developed, the German princes that wanted to reform the church had very different ideas than what Martin Luther had in mind, because they seen an institution that was depending on their military support in order to continue its existence. And the church had a tremendous amount of wealth and a tremendous amount of control over various revenue streams that were leaving Germany and going to Rome. And in Germany and the various different principalities in Germany, the church owned between 20 and 30% of the land. So there's enormous wealth. Actually, the same is true in England. Under King Henry VIII, the church owned somewhere around 25% of the land. So there's trillions of dollars or trillions of euros worth of wealth under church control. And Luther appealed in 1520 for these princes to come in and reform the church. He didn't actually quite understand the way they'd see that invitation. And as the 20s developed, these princes decided to basically take control of church land, take over monasteries, take over churches, take over tens of thousands of acres of land. And this developed into various different conflicts between different princes, some that wanted to remain loyal to the Catholic theology and some that wanted to support this reform idea, Luther's. So one of the things that is remarkable about the Reformation is that it actually started not just in Germany alone, but it also started in Switzerland. And in Switzerland, the actual leader of the movement there in that country was much more radical than Luther. He had far more radical ideas. For instance, he didn't believe that the Eucharist was the real presence of Christ. And he had other ideas as well. So throughout the 20s, of course, Luther had very fundamental differences also with another radical type of reformer, which was known as Anabaptists. They believed that there was no such thing as infant baptism, and they wanted to see everybody rebaptized, and that created all sorts of stress in the movement throughout the mid-20s. And Of course, actually, as well as that, you had the actual situation where Munzer, who actually led a revolt, the Peasants War, the German Peasants War, that was in 1524-25, with the result that as the 20s developed, Luther found himself not really, I mean, he was the man that started this entire reform movement. He wasn't really in control of it, though. And by the late 20s, 1529, of course, he met Zwingli, the leader of the Swiss reform movement, but they couldn't agree, actually, in relation to the Eucharist in particular. Martin Luther had been a priest he became a priest in 1507. He left, or was excommunicated around 21. So he was actually a priest for 13 or 14 years, and he was a very strong believer in the Eucharist as a priest. So he differed completely with Zwingli on this point. This is actually the beginning of an unraveling of the actual entire Reformation movement. A decade later, John Calvin came in to develop his own ideas. And Switzerland at that time was split into various things, areas, regions known as cantons. Some of them were, of course, pro-Catholic, and some of them wanted to support the Reform ideas. And basically, because of this conflict of interest, some of these cantons in the early 30s got involved in what became a sort of civil war between the various cantons in Switzerland. And Zwingli himself actually was a very strong believer in that the reform movement should be supported by both politicians and princes and military and all. And basically he got killed 2 years after he met Luther at Marlborough Castle when they were trying to agree on a unified platform. They couldn't agree because they split on the Eucharist. Martin Luther, of course, was a priest for 12, 13 years, and he was a very strong believer in the Eucharist. He never gave up his belief in the Eucharist, actually. He just defined it differently to the Catholic Church. He claimed that the real presence of Jesus was in the Eucharist, but coexisted with bread, which is different, but not very different to the Catholic theology. But Zwingli had completely different ideas in relation to this. He believed the bread was nothing more than a symbol. So that later developed into what became known as Calvinist, John Calvinist ideology, was the theologian who gave voice to that particular idea in subsequent centuries. But back in the 20s, German princes began to realize that there was a tremendous amount of wealth, a tremendous amount of power to be gained. So there was political influence, national identity, tremendous amount of extra land to be gained, all by supporting the reform movement of Martin Luther. Actually, in the 1930s, King Henry VIII, who was a young king at that stage, actually, he had been a very strong supporter of the papacy initially. In actual fact, he was given a title. Henry VIII became king in 1509, I think it was, 1509. The same year as John Calvin was born, actually. Henry VIII was only 18 years of age at that stage. And he became King of England, and he was a very strong supporter of the Pope for the first few years. But then he wanted to ensure that there would be a male heir to continue his, to succeed in the throne situation, and his wife was unable to bear a child, so he wanted a divorce, fell out with the Pope over that, but there was also other political implications as well. But as well as that, like by the 1530s, King Henry VIII had begun to recognize what was happening in Germany, which was that there was a monumental takeover of land by German princes. He recognized that the Church in England either owned or controlled about 1/5, maybe up to 1/4 of the land of England, trillions of euros worth of land by today's standards. So it wasn't so much that King Henry VIII had some sort of a theological breakthrough in relation to faith alone and scripture alone and total depravity and all this stuff. It was at least as much that there was a tremendous amount of political independence could be achieved, less revenue going to Rome, and a takeover of church land. And all of these things represented a tremendous increase in the power, not just of King Henry VIII, of course, but German princes and princes all over Europe that actually seen the opportunity here to gain in terms of wealth, power, glory, and independence, national independence. And of course, that's why Europe became, Christian identities became associated with various countries. You think of Spain, Catholic, Ireland, Catholic, England, Protestant, German, Protestant, and these various identities and conflicts developed from the Reformation. But in fairness to Luther, when he was writing that booklet in 1520, inviting the German princes to get involved in church affairs, he wouldn't have foreseen any of this. Nobody could have foreseen what actually happened. Various different wars that took place over the following decades and following centuries took the lives of millions of people, and at least 10 million people died in the various religious wars that occurred in Europe. And that was a tragedy, an unforeseen tragedy, in fairness. Luther thought he was going to be able to contain the political people that he got involved, but he found that he had no control of them. He found actually on a number of occasions throughout his life that he wasn't in control of events. The first time he found that was actually when he printed up the 95 Theses in Latin, but German students behind his back decided to print them up in German and spread them all over the place into various different cities. Luther didn't intend that. Then in a situation in relation to inviting in the princes into bringing about church reform, that brought about all sorts of wars and conflicts. He didn't intend that either. But there's a lot of things then, like the various, he promoted the actual idea of scriptural law. He believed that was a great thing, but he didn't actually understand that, or he didn't seem to understand that all these great theologians like himself, Zwingli, Calvin, couldn't agree on anything. And that in itself actually caused all sorts of divisions as well. And it actually found a new sort of exhilaration of division once this ideology crossed the Atlantic into America, because there was no states there to actually impose either one type of religion or another, and therefore it's a kind of a free-for-all. And that's why America became unique in terms of its thousands of denominations which exist there today. So I leave it at that for today, and thank you very much for watching. I'll do a wrap-up video on this, the last video, in a week's time, bring all this together and sort of the Reformation and its consequences throughout Europe and throughout the world. So thank you very much for watching for today, and goodbye for now.